Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining me today for episode 767 of People Behind the Science. Today, we are excited to be revisiting our interview with Dr. Douglas Futuyma. Listeners, throughout his career, Douglas has been fascinated by evolution and how species adapt to their environments. Much of his research has examined the ways in which insects that eat plants have evolved, or perhaps failed to evolve, and their ability to eat different kinds of plants. Beyond his specific research area of expertise, Douglas has taught courses on evolution and evolutionary ecology, as well as served as a general spokesperson for evolution. And in our conversation, he talks more about his life, his career, and his research. So listeners, I hope you enjoy this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Listeners, I am thrilled to introduce you all today to our wonderful guest, Dr. Douglas Futuyma. So, Douglas, welcome to our show. How are you today?
I'm just fine, thank you, and I hope all is well with you, Marie.
I'm doing quite well. Thank you for asking. And I'm excited to chat with you about your life and your work. But first, I do want to take a moment to introduce you to our listeners. So listeners, Douglas is a distinguished professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolution at Stony Brook University. He also holds an appointment as a research associate at the American Museum of Natural History. Douglas received his bachelor's degree in conservation from Cornell University and his master's and Ph.D. degrees in zoology from the University of Michigan. After receiving his Ph.D., Douglas joined the faculty at Stony Brook University, where he has worked for most of his career. He served on the faculty at the University of Michigan for a few years, from 2002 to 2004, before returning to Stony Brook. And Douglas has written one of the most popular textbooks on evolution, and he has received numerous awards and honors over the course of his career. He is an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences, a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Douglas was also awarded the SUNY Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Fulbright Senior Scholarship, the Sewall Wright Award from the American Society of Naturalists, the Joseph Leidy Award from the Academy of Natural Sciences of Drexel University, and also an Honorary Doctoral Degree from the National University of Mongolia. And in our interview today, Douglas is going to tell us more about both his life and his science. And we'd love to hear a little bit about your life first. So can you tell us how you like to spend your time, Douglas, when you're not very busy doing science?
Well, I have two passions. The first is not unrelated to my work. I have been since boyhood a pretty passionate naturalist. So I just love being outdoors, looking at natural history. And that means, well, especially for about the last 25 years, being a pretty obsessive birdwatcher, both here at home. So I'm part of the local birding community, and I go out just about every weekend for a little while, as well as around the world. And this is, of course, a wonderful opportunity to see natural environments, all sorts of wonderful exotic species, as well as, of course, the people around the world. So it's a wonderful vehicle for that. So that's one. And my other passion is classical music and opera. I have a subscription to the Metropolitan Opera that I've had for many years. Just saw Parsifal last week, thrilling performance, and classical music generally, as well as the other arts, but especially music.
That is phenomenal. So do you play any music yourself, or do you enjoy just listening?
I wish. I can't even read music.
It's never too late to start. Well, Doug, wonderful to hear about life outside of science. And I'm interested in this bird watching. So do you have a particular maybe bucket list of birds that you want to see, or a particular bird that's evaded you?
Something that I hope to see later this year in Ghana is something called the white-necked rockfowl, or Picathartes, and it is a very strange-looking bird indeed that builds its mud nests on the side of rock walls in the middle of rainforests. And when I was a kid, I saw a pair of these in the Bronx Zoo, and the image of those birds has never left my mind, and I want to see them in the wild.
I love it. Well, you've painted a beautiful picture of their habitat in these exotic birds. So wonderful to hear about life outside of science. But I do want to talk about your work next. And I think oftentimes for biologists and naturalists, there can be some overlap in terms of the work you do and the things you're passionate about. But how do you describe what you do at work to someone who's interested?
Right. Well, I should say that I'm on the border of retirement. That doesn't mean I'm going to stop doing scientific activities, but it does mean that pretty much my research is behind me. So basically, I'm an evolutionary biologist. I'm especially interested in the evolution of ways in which species adapt to their environment. So that also involves a lot of biological ecology. So as a professor, my career has been one first of teaching a variety of courses, mostly about evolution and what we call evolutionary ecology. Secondly, doing research, which, as I say, is now pretty much over. But that has been on the ways in which insects which eat plants have evolved their ability to eat, or failure to be able to evolve to eat different kinds of plants. And we can come back to that in a moment. And then thirdly, as you mentioned, I'm the author of a textbook about evolution that has been, I should say, quite successful. And that's led me to sort of a variety of roles within evolutionary science and to some extent spokesperson for evolution, as well as engaged in a lot of editorial activities.
Certainly. And I think in addition, like you said, to these plant-insect interactions that you've studied, being known as a general expert on evolution is no small task. And I think this is every scientist's sort of worst nightmare, because we often tend to really get tunnel vision and focus really specifically in one certain area. Was it scary the first couple times that you had to go out there and sort of be expected to kind of know everything about evolution?
Well, that means it's scary just to teach a course on the subject, because evolution embraces everything about living organisms in one way or another. Today, it ranges all the way from the fossil record and paleontology all the way through genome science and everything in between. So it's a little pretentious to think that you can cover that field. So the result is I'm sort of a jack of all trades and master of none. I have a superficial knowledge of a lot of things, but it is, as you say, a somewhat daunting position at times. And I can always say that anything I think I know about, there are a lot of people out there who are far more expert than I am on that subject.
Well, I think you've done some great work in this area of kind of outreach and general education, but I do want to talk a little bit about what motivates you to do all these different things that you do in your day. I mean, you're balancing a lot of different activities, wearing a lot of different hats. Do you have a favorite quote or a saying or something that goes through your mind, Doug, that really keeps you in it?
There are a few, but here's one that I like. Our remedies oft in ourselves do lie, which we ascribe to heaven. The fated sky gives us free scope. Only doth backward pull our slow designs when we ourselves are dull. So that sounds like Shakespeare, and it is. It's from All's Well That Ends Well. And what is our remedies oft in ourselves do lie? That is, don't look to others, don't look to fate, don't look to some outside forces to achieve your aims, but find the energy in yourself. And I suppose you could say that this was kind of an early expression of the power of positive thinking. So I try to maintain that positive approach, and I do that really because I love my subject. I am as thrilled by the diversity of animals and plants and living things today as I was when I was a high school student. And I'm just thrilled by the knowledge and the understanding that we've acquired of how this marvelous diversity of life has come into existence. And I love communicating that to people. Just teaching to me is a very rewarding activity, writing about it, giving lectures about it, and it just continues to thrill me.
Absolutely. And I think the students and the people that you're speaking to can sort of sense that passion, and it gets them excited about it as well, which is awesome. And I think through your career and the different activities you've participated in, you've really been able to kind of teach and mentor and inspire a lot of different people. But Douglas, I'm curious to hear a little bit about some of these people who might have had this sort of impact on you and who your role models and inspirational figures are or were.
A few. One very inspirational figure whom I didn't meet until I was well into my career was Ernst Mayr. Mayr was himself a naturalist as a young man and became one of the most accomplished ornithologists in the world. And he also then became one of the people who most shaped modern evolutionary theory, although that's a bad word, but the way we think about how evolution works. And I became acquainted with his books early on. In fact, one of his papers about the classification of birds was probably the first scientific article I ever read. It was given to me by an older birder when I was in high school. And Mayr's integration of what he knew about birds and other organisms, together with ideas of how evolution written works was absolutely inspiring to me. And just the breadth of his command, the breadth of examples that he would use really inspired me to try to learn all that. So he was one. My Ph.D. advisor, Lawrence Slobodkin at the University of Michigan, was certainly another. He was kind of a quirky, original thinker, and sometimes his ideas were kind of a little bit off, and sometimes they were absolutely brilliant and right on. But the other thing that I learned from him was he was the first biologist I met who was also in some sense an intellectual. That is to say, he was interested in larger social issues, he was interested in political issues, he was interested in the arts and literature, and that to me also became inspiring, that you could have this breadth of vision, and I'm not sure that mine has ever matched his, but he was certainly an inspiring figure.
Absolutely. And I love this kind of role model or mentor that you had in terms of this well-rounded thinker, because I think so often people in science, like I said, you get pigeonholed or tunnel vision that you're really only focusing on one thing, but you lose sight of the arts, the literature, a lot of these other areas in life that can add so much enrichment.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Well, wonderful to hear about some of the people who inspired you, Doug. And you mentioned that you were already getting academic papers on birds at the early age of a high school student. So I'm curious to hear about where your interest in science began. Does it go back even farther than this?
Oh, yeah. Well, not in science, but in animals, yes. And certainly by the time I was in 4th or 5th grade, I was already enchanted by the diversity of animals. And that's because I grew up in the Bronx. People don't think, growing up in the Bronx in New York City, how could you possibly become a naturalist? Right. But the answer is the Bronx Zoo, which at that time was the largest zoo in the country, meaning having the greatest diversity of birds and reptiles, amphibians and mammals of any zoo in the country. And I, already by 5th grade, I was taking the subway up to the Bronx Zoo, becoming fascinated by all this diversity. I really fell in love both with the enormous diversity of birds and reptiles in particular, and got to know some of the zookeepers there who sort of fostered my interests. And probably by 6th or 7th grade, I was going out into the New York City parks, because actually New York City has some absolutely wonderful parks where you can find all sorts of insects and frogs and salamanders and, of course, birds. So I started doing that, and at one point or another, I started meeting some older bird watchers after I'd gotten my first pair of monoculars from my father. Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget one of them showing me a great horned owl, which is a magnificent bird, right there in the Bronx Botanical Garden, right in New York City.
Oh, wow.
And that sort of cemented it. So the result of that was that all through high school, I knew I wanted to do something with animals, whatever that might be, and I knew that that meant going to college, and everyone in my high school went to college. I was very fortunate in going to a very good high school in New York City. So I ended up at Cornell, which was probably the best place for someone of my interests, where I had courses about birds and fish, insects and plants and everything else, as well as, of course, the other aspects of biology, physiology, biochemistry, genetics, ecology. So that really shaped my understanding of what biological science was, and not simply delighting in the diversity of life. It shaped my understanding of biological science, and I realized that the fields of ecology and evolutionary biology were those that seemed to most pertain to understanding this diversity of animal life and plant life that so enchanted me. So I went off for master's and Ph.D. work at the University of Michigan, which had many faculty members who were experts in various animal groups, and there ended up studying under Lawrence Slobodkin, an ecologist, as I mentioned. So that's where I got a Ph.D. Mm-hmm. I ended up at Stony Brook. When I was finishing my Ph.D., I interviewed at a few places and I had one other option. But shortly before then, Slobodkin was tapped to move from the University of Michigan to Long Island, where there was this new campus being developed that promised, in the words of Governor Rockefeller at that time, it was going to be the Berkeley of the East.
Oh, wow.
This was a new university campus at Stony Brook on Long Island that no one had ever heard of before. But Larry was induced to come here and initiate a Department of Ecology and Evolution, which was one of the first two such departments in this country. Before then, there had been zoology and botany departments, but it was a period in which biology was being kind of reorganized more along sort of molecular biological versus organismal biological lines. So he founded this department, and his idea of how to found a new department was to hire a couple of famous people and a bunch of promising young people. So the promising young people he knew included several of us from the University of Michigan who were finishing our degrees at that time. So 3 of us came here among the first members of this department. And of the 3, 2 moved elsewhere eventually, and only I am left to tell the tale.
So what has it been like kind of watching the department grow from the very beginning to now where it is today so many years later?
Well, obviously, lots of ups and downs. The university as a whole is immensely greater and more complicated, and I have to say more bureaucratic than it was then. And the department really grew rather rapidly to be recognized as a really major intellectual center of ecology and evolutionary biology. And we have, for most of our history, then sustained this stature as really one of the very best departments in my field. I have to say we're going through great struggles right now because of budget cuts and so forth in the university, but nonetheless, we remain, I think, a very strong department in these areas. So I've been blessed by having really, really good colleagues and really, really good graduate students, not just in my own lab, but in the department as a whole. And we've been very collegial. It's a department in which every week we have a visiting speaker, and we all go listen to that speaker, whether the subject is in our particular research area or elsewhere. So that's been very important for my growth as a scientist.
Certainly. Well, that sounds absolutely wonderful. And one thing that really struck me as you were talking about your interest outside of science as well as your career path is this passion you've had for birds. So it really makes me wonder what then drew you to this plant-insect interaction area?
Okay. Well, number one, I took an entomology course, a course in the insect taxonomy when I was an undergraduate as a senior with William L. Brown, Jr., who was the world's expert on the taxonomy and diversity of ants. And he was another very charismatic and very influential person in my life. So the result of that was that I also fell in love with insects. So I've taught an entomology course here a number of times, and I've probably enjoyed teaching that more than anything else. So that wasn't a difficult jump. But the answer was that in the early 1970s, one of the big questions in evolutionary biology, it had been revealed that most species of humans and flies and everything else have a lot of genetic variation. That is to say, you and I are genetically different, and in fact, any 2 people who aren't identical twins are genetically different. And you can use various techniques to see that, yeah, we differ in a lot of our genes. And the question was, what accounts for the existence of this genetic variation? Why aren't all members of the species population the same? So I had the idea that maybe different genotypes would be adapted to different aspects of the environment. And I thought that, well, suppose you compared an insect that eats only one kind of plant with an insect that eats many kinds of plants. Maybe what you would find is that the one that eats many kinds of plants would consist of a whole different kind of genetic subtypes, each of which was best adapted to one of those many plants. So that was my first big research project that really drew me into using insects that feed on plants as a vehicle for understanding a broader problem in evolutionary biology and evolutionary genetics. And then, of course, I found that the enormous diversity of insects that eat plants are a whole world full of interesting questions to ask and interesting species to study.
Definitely. So is there a particular insect that is maybe your favorite or one you find most fascinating?
Well, there have been several, but one of them I'll mention. So we did this study in which we used, the methodology of the day was to grind up insects or just a tissue sample from an animal and examine its proteins. And if you found that 2 members of the species had a different version of a particular protein, that was an indication that they differed with respect to the gene which is responsible for producing that protein. So that was a way of examining genetic differences among individuals of a species. So we studied a number of different species of moths to see if the species that were capable of eating many kinds of plants would show more genetic differences as revealed by these proteins than a species of moth that eats just one kind of plant. And I should say the moth itself doesn't eat the plant. It's rather the larva, the caterpillar. That's the stage that eats the plant. And in the course of this, we found, every species of moth that we looked at, sure, they showed some genetic differences among individuals, and no two individuals were alike, the same as no two humans are alike unless they're identical twins. And then we found this one species, it's called the fall cankerworm moth, in which we found a whole bunch of different caterpillars that we collected just from oak trees, that they all had pretty much the same genetic profile. It all looked as if they were identical twins, which was very weird.
Strange.
And then we found, there are actually a number of these different gene combinations. So there are a number of different, not pairs of identical twins, but sets of identical individuals. So, for example, on maple trees, we found, there's another genetic combination, which we find many, many caterpillars with this genetic combination. So that told us that there was something very curious about this species. And what it said was, they must be reproducing asexually. In other words, a female would have offspring who are all identical to one another. They'd form kind of a clone. And this is not unprecedented. Quite a number of other species of animals are known to be like this. I think that was known from only one other species of moth in the world at that time. So this was a pretty stunning discovery. Mm-hmm. The weird thing about it, though, was that if you go out in the fall when the moths are out, what you see is females with their abdomens releasing pheromones, that is, chemicals which are designed to attract males, and you do indeed find male moths coming to mate with them. So it was very weird because it looks like, sex is going on, but nonetheless it looks like you have these caterpillars being produced asexually without the mixing of the genes from a male and a female. So it was very, very strange.
Sure. Well, this mysterious fall cankerworm moth sounds very intriguing. So thank you for sharing the story behind this exciting insect. And we've talked about some of the different experiences you've had over the course of your career, Douglas, but I'm curious to hear if there's a particular project or a particular thing that you studied or worked on that was just the most memorable, or one of the projects you've been the most excited to be a part of that you want to share with us today.
So I've just talked about how there's genetic variation among members of the population. And for evolution to work, there has to be some genetic variation. In other words, evolution simply doesn't operate if all individuals are exactly the same. You need to have genetic mutations that alter some feature of an organism. And some of those mutations very, very rarely turn out to produce a version of the organism that is better able to survive or reproduce because of some altered characteristic that perhaps fits it to its environment, right? So that's the principle of evolution by natural selection. But natural selection can work only if there are genetic differences in some characteristic among the individuals in the population. So it turns out that very often mutations have occurred in the past, and they kind of accumulate within a species. That's what I was studying with these caterpillars. These mutations accumulate so that there's already a lot of genetic variation within a population, so that when an environment changes, often the species doesn't have to wait for new mutations to happen that just might happen to make it better for this new environment. Rather, it'll turn out that some of these mutations that have accumulated just fortuitously happen to be just exactly what the doctor ordered for this new environment. So this is the basis, for example, for the evolution of resistance to insecticides. So any number of species of insects that are pests, including, for example, malaria-bearing mosquitoes, have evolved to be resistant to DDT and every other insecticide that's been thrown at them. And that's because mutations are already in the population. If you've got millions and millions of mosquitoes, some of them have mutations that just happen to make them a little bit more resistant to DDT or whatever the insecticide is. This turns out to be really common. In other words, a lot of species have adapted very rapidly to changes in their environment, even to changes that humans have made in the environment. That's not to say that any species can adapt to any alteration of the environment that we impose. That's definitely not the case. In fact, a lot of species are becoming extinct because of what we're doing as a species to change the world. So here's this general notion among evolutionary biologists that most species are pretty flexible genetically and can pretty rapidly adapt to changes in the environment. Well, there are other aspects of the diversity of life, though, that really are very puzzling then. For example, there are many groups of insects in which all the related species in a group form one big branch of the great tree of life, and all of them go back to a common ancestor, which could be 50 million years ago, 60 million years ago, and all of them feed on pretty much the same kind of plant. So you may be familiar, for example, you see white butterflies flying around pretty much anywhere in eastern United States in spring and summer. Mm-hmm. Those butterflies lay eggs on plants in the mustard family. Those are cabbage white butterflies. At least that's the most common one. So their larvae, their caterpillars, eat mustard plants. And that is true for hundreds of species of butterflies in that group, all of which come from one common ancestor about 80 million years ago. And almost all those species have larvae that feed only on plants in the mustard family. So that is really weird, because we think they should be adaptable to feed on other kinds of plants, considering the great evolutionary flexibility of so many species.
Right.
So I postulated, well, maybe species of insects just don't have the genetic variation that would be required to take a big jump and become adapted to a totally different group of plants. And I won't say that this is a heretical position, but it's definitely not the most popular one, because everyone's so wedded to this idea that species are really adaptable. And to make a long story short, we used a group of beetle species, all of which are related to one another, and they all feed on plants in the daisy family. And we basically did a whole bunch of tests in which we looked to see whether these species had the genetic potentiality for feeding on a different kind of plant than the one that they normally feed on. And what we found was that you have one species that eats goldenrods, which are in that same family, and another species that eats ragweeds. And, well, it turns out that those beetles don't seem to have the genetic potentiality of switching from ragweed to goldenrod or vice versa. So there really are constraints then that seem to limit the genetic potentialities, the possible avenues of evolutionary change that a species or its descendants might be capable of. And this is becoming a really big theme in evolutionary biology. It's like we understand a lot about the process by which species do adapt to different environments, but what we don't understand very well is the cases of failure. What are the situations under which a species can't adapt to a new aspect of the environment? And, of course, that's really important because one consequence of failing to adapt is extinction.
Right.
And that, of course, has been true of the vast, vast majority of species that have ever lived. So one of the things we really don't understand very well is extinction. Why does extinction happen instead of adaptation? So both the ability to evolve and the inability to evolve adaptively, they're two sides of the same coin, and they're both really interesting.
Absolutely. I think these ideas of host specificity and the genetic flexibility are really fascinating. And this particular experiment that you mentioned sort of had a happy ending. You got an exciting discovery out of it. But I know that's not always the case. I think the careers of scientists are littered with these challenges and failures and things that don't turn out quite right or like you expect them. So Douglas, do you have a story of challenge or failure or one of these moments of scientific confusion?
Oh, I probably got more of them than I remember because you don't like to remember the things that didn't work. Well, let me go back to that fall cankerworm moth that I was talking about. Mm-hmm. So remember that we found evidence that it was really weird that obviously there was sex going on because we have male moths mating with females, but then we also had this genetic indication that females must be producing lots of babies that are all genetically identical to one another. Mm-hmm. So we started collecting females and getting egg masses from them so we'd be able to see whether all the offspring of a female indeed had the same genotype. And it was very puzzling because very often the females would lay eggs and then they wouldn't hatch. Some of the females, their eggs are hatching, but a lot of them, they weren't hatching. And this is because we were just going out and collecting female moths at night in November when they come out in the late fall. So needless to say, this really frustrated our opportunity to do some critical experiments. They only come out once a year, so we had to wait until the next year to be able to do the experiments. So we started fooling around and said, well, what are these males doing? And we ended up doing an experiment in which we caged some females just by themselves, and in others we gave them a male. And lo and behold, it turned out that if you give a female a male, her eggs will hatch.
Interesting.
But nevertheless, all her offspring are genetically identical. And it turns out, well, they have the same genotype as their mother. So the female's mating with a male, but he ends up not being a father. In other words, the offspring don't receive any of his genes. Mm-hmm. So this turned out to be, from that point of view, a happy ending because it was frustrating for a while, but we solved the issue. We figured out finally what was going on. We don't know exactly what's going on. There are a few other examples of this that have been described in various insects and other animals in which it appears as if having the sperm penetrate the egg is important for getting the egg to start developing. But nevertheless, the male's chromosomes, his genes, are not then actually incorporated into what will become the embryo. It's a very bizarre genetic system. So here you've got this situation in which you have these asexual females that are almost like sexual parasites. They're using these males, but the males don't contribute. Now imagine you have one female moth who has 50 offspring, and half of them are normal sexuals, and half of them are male and half female offspring. And there must be some moths out there that are like that, because we do have male moths.
Right.
So imagine you have a sexual female who produces, on average, 25 daughters and 25 sons, and compare her to another moth who also has 50 eggs, but she's asexual. She just uses the male and throws away his genes, and then proceeds to have 50 babies, and all of her babies are daughters. Mm-hmm. Well, think of the mathematical consequences of that, because the next generation, the sexual female has 25 daughters times 50 offspring, whatever that number turns out to be. And that's the number of her grandchildren. But the asexual female has 50 daughters times 50 offspring. So that's twice as many grandchildren. Mm-hmm. And do that for a few more generations, what you're going to find is almost the entire population is going to be made up of asexuals. Because every generation they produce twice as many offspring that are going to make, again, twice as many offspring.
Right.
So in no time, you've got a population which is 99% asexual. And at that point, the population should go extinct. Because
there aren't any males to activate, yeah.
So there's something very weird going on. Something is maintaining a reasonably high frequency or high percentage of sexual females in the population. And we tried to figure out, what is it? What is this sexually reproducing component of the population of moths have going for it that enables them to persist? And we could never figure that out. We thought, well, maybe their offspring are adapted to a different kind of plant that the asexuals aren't using, or maybe the males really prefer to mate with sexual females and only occasionally are tricked by the asexual females, and we couldn't find any evidence for those. And we finally just sort of gave up and we said, we just don't know. Let's move on to another question. And I hate to admit defeat, but we were defeated.
Oh, wow.
So there's a project out there that's waiting for someone who's more creative or
has newer tools, yeah.
Better tools, yeah.
Well, listeners, this mystery awaits you, I must say.
If you're out there, look in early May. If you're in eastern North America, you'll find fall cankerworm caterpillars, sometimes green, sometimes black, on lots of different kinds of trees, oaks and maples and elms and all kinds of trees. They'll eat them. Just waiting for someone to study it some more.
I love it. Well, Douglas, thank you so much for sharing one of these unsolved mysteries from your own research portfolio. But we don't just want to talk about the mysterious and challenging projects. I'd love to talk about some of your successes. And I know you have quite a few to choose from here, but do you have a favorite success story that you want to share with us today?
I would say what I was telling you about the beetles, and I'll expand on that because this is some of the research that I'm really happiest with. So remember, this was following on the idea that maybe there are genetic constraints so that it's really hard, or maybe, who knows, almost impossible for an insect to adapt to a really different kind of plant. Mm-hmm. So here you had these beetles, all these related species, about 15 different species, all feeding on different plants that are in the sunflower family, which is a very, very big, diverse family of plants. And I thought, if the history of evolutionary change in their feeding habits, if that's been guided by genetic constraints so that only certain paths of possible evolutionary change are open and other conceivable paths of evolutionary change are closed or off limits, well, if that's the case, then maybe what we would see is that the genetic potentiality of a species could be related in one way or another to the entire evolutionary history by which those species have evolved from a common ancestor. So what do I mean by that? What we might find is that if we were to look at all the relationships among these different species of beetles, they all come from one common ancestor back on, and probably on the order of 40 million years ago. We have reason to think it's 40 million years ago, because we did DNA studies, which then enabled us to draw a kind of phylogenetic tree of which species are most closely related to which others. Okay, so this is an evolutionary tree of Ophrella beetles. They don't have an English name.
Well, that name's lovely, so that's fine. Yeah.
So we have an evolutionary tree. So I thought, well, maybe it's possible that a species of beetle could branch off and adapt to a different kind of plant from what its ancestor fed on, maybe only if that plant is closely related to the plant that its ancestor fed on. In other words, maybe they can adapt to plants that are closely related and therefore not too different from one another, compared to being able to adapt to a plant which is more distantly related and might be more different in its chemical characteristics or other characteristics. Maybe that would be a leap too far. So we looked at the phylogeny and we thought, yes, that is the case. It does appear usually that if you look at two species that are each other's closest relatives, they also feed on two different kinds of plants that are very closely related within the sunflower family. So in other words, by and large, evolution is going by relatively small steps, not big flying leaps. So we said, well, if that's the case, then when we do our genetic studies and we look to see if a species has the genetic potential for possibly adapting to a different kind of plant than its normal plant, what we ought to see then is if it has any genetic potential at all for adapting to a different kind of plant, it's most likely to have the genetic potential for adapting to a plant that is closely related to its normal host plant. So if you're feeding on ragweed, there's another kind of plant called marsh elder, which is more closely related to ragweed than to other members of that big plant family. So we said, if we take a ragweed feeding beetle, maybe it will have some genetic variants within the population that have the potential for feeding on marsh elder, even if it doesn't have any such genetic potential for feeding on goldenrods, which are much more distantly related plants. They're not related closely to ragweeds. And that's just what we found. So it turned out that there were cases in which it looked like species do have some genetic potential for adapting to a different kind of plant, but usually that would be a plant that is closely related to what they're used to feeding on. And that matches the whole evolutionary history that we discovered by looking at the relationships among these beetles and how related species of beetles usually feed on related plants. And I really like that because it's one of the first studies that I think people have done in which they're trying to match what you see at the level of the evolutionary processes that are happening just within individual species, sometimes called microevolutionary change, trying to relate evolutionary processes within species to sort of the grand story of what has been played out in evolution over the course of millions of years, what's sometimes called macroevolution. So we find a bridge, a parallel between microevolution, which we can study actually sometimes going on in front of our eyes. Can we find a bridge between that and evolution as it's played out over many millions of years? So this experiment is sort of one little step in that direction, and it's something I feel really particularly satisfied with.
Absolutely. Well, congratulations on this successful experiment. And like you said, this is a really exciting line of research and tells a nice story of the evolution and kind of ties a couple pieces together that I think people usually don't tie together when they're thinking about it.
Absolutely. And here I am working in areas that are often thought to be like, these are really abstruse. Who really cares about beetles that attack goldenrods?
I think it's cool.
And much less their genetic variation or the family tree of beetles. Who cares about that, right? What good is that? And the answer is actually, well, it could be pretty good. It could be pretty important. One of these beetle species feeds on ragweed. I mentioned that earlier. Well, ragweed is an American plant. It's a Native American plant. And you know that ragweed is a serious cause of hay fever. Really serious. Ragweed has become a serious weed throughout much of Europe and over into Asia. And the question is there any way of controlling it? And there's no way, here's something that's growing along roadsides and shallow fields and whatever, and there's no way to be able to control it everywhere by using an herbicide.
Right.
So the question is, might there be a way in which you could use a natural enemy of the plant to suppress it, to keep it down? So, in fact, European scientists who have been concerned with the possibility of what's called biological control of this pest plant, European scientists have actually been looking at one of my Ophrella beetles to ask the question, could this be a candidate for an insect that could be imported to Europe and serve as a natural control of this really serious plant pest? So lo and behold, it turns out that my favorite beetles, which I assure you I didn't choose them because they might possibly be useful for biological control. I chose them for a bunch of other very arcane reasons. But it turns out they contacted me. They brought me over to Paris a couple of years ago to talk with them. And one of the points that I raised, which they were aware of course, was, well, even if we bring over this plant this beetle to control ragweed, is there any potential that it could evolve to attack other kinds of plants that are not weeds or might even be important crop plants? And in particular, sunflower, which is a commercially important plant, right. Sunflower is in the same family as ragweed. Mm-hmm. So the question is there a potentiality for this ragweed specialist to undergo a genetic change, an evolutionary change, and adapt to sunflower? So this is where my kind of work becomes very relevant. It seems totally arcane and abstruse, and it's being done in the service of understanding these grand ideas about evolution, but it really can be seriously useful. And in fact, several of my Ph.D. students and a couple of other students from Stony Brook here over the years who have done Ph.D. work with me or my colleagues on the evolutionary ecology of insect-plant interactions, several of them have gone on to very rewarding careers in applying these ideas to real-life situations in agriculture, controlling agricultural pest insects. One of them who got his degree here many years ago, and he is a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He's very distinguished. He's had an international career developing these ideas about modeling evolutionary changes insofar as they could end up being a serious problem for trying to control insect pests of crops. And I have another student who's at Iowa State University, and he is working on basically evolution of corn pests, which is, if you're from Iowa, you know that there are insects that are serious pests of corn, right. And whether or not you can control them partly depends on the ability of those insects to evolve.
Absolutely. Well, this is an exciting success, and congratulations on these projects. And I'm really glad that you brought up these applications to some of the downstream things that this type of research that you're doing can be used for, because I think so often scientists, especially those in basic research, are faced with this kind of so what question from the public. And I think you don't necessarily have to know that up front for that research to be valuable in the future.
Absolutely. I think it is so important for people to understand that every aspect of our life depends in one way or another on technology. It depends on the applications of science, of physical science, of chemistry, of biology. So much of our food depends on food science, which depends on biology. And almost all of those sciences, those applications depend on the fundamental understanding of physics, of chemistry, of biology, of genetics, of evolution, of ecology, of physiology, of all these basic sciences in which it's the fundamental, how does it work in nature? People just ask, how does it work? And understanding how nature works, whether it's how organisms work or how molecules work or how the universe works, that fundamental understanding, which scientists pursue largely out of their own curiosity, just because they want to know, they want to understand the world around us. That understanding is the indispensable foundation for being able to develop the technology that we all depend on, the biological and the physical and the chemical technology that every aspect of our life depends on.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that this project came along with an opportunity to travel to Paris. And I love talking about some of these travel opportunities that scientists get to share their work or work with collaborators. So do you have a favorite place, Douglas, that science has taken you?
So many. That's a hard choice. Mm-hmm. Let me mention two.
Sure.
One, which is probably closest to my heart, is Costa Rica. Since I was a kid, going to the Bronx Zoo, seeing all these exotic tropical birds and reptiles and mammals, I wanted to go to the tropics. It's like I knew this is where there's this incredible diversity of exotic animals, toucans and jaguars and crocodiles and boa constrictors and fer-de-lance and vipers and all kinds of things that I wanted to see. So the summer after my first year in graduate school, I had the opportunity to go to Costa Rica to take one of the very first courses that was offered there by an organization that had recently been formed called the Organization for Tropical Studies, which since has become a major force in educating hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of students about tropical organisms, tropical ecology, as well as branching out into things like tropical diseases and some social aspects and so on. And they now have several research stations in Costa Rica. And eventually I ended up teaching in that tropical ecology course many times. And since then I've gone back there a few times just on my own with friends to look at birds. And Costa Rica is this marvelous country with incredible biological diversity, The government there has been, for a long time, strongly committed to ecological conservation and land conservation, so that ecotourism is, I think, their second most important source of national income. There are these beautiful national parks and rainforests and dry deciduous forests and so on. And I fell in love with Costa Rica that first time, and every time that I've been back there since, it is very close to my heart. But I want to mention another country, and this is just a few weeks ago. This is the third time I've been in Turkey. And I was invited to be part of a 2-day weekend symposium or conference on evolution that was held in Ankara, the capital of Turkey. As you may know, among Western countries, the United States is closest to the bottom in terms of the percentage of people who accept evolution. At the bottom is Turkey.
Oh, really?
In which there's been a lot of anti-evolution propaganda for a long time. And basically, it's a matter of the perception that there's a conflict between religious belief and evolution. And recently, the Turkish government essentially has forbidden the teaching of evolution in high schools. It is still being taught, at least in a couple of the large universities, but my impression is that in small colleges and universities, they've abandoned the teaching of evolution because they are afraid of penalties. So it's a highly repressive situation. I was invited to this 2-day conference, which was entirely organized by undergraduate students. They've put this on a number of times before, so they know what they're doing. It was a totally professionally organized conference. These students knew exactly how to mount it, and in every way. They had been able to raise funds to be able to fly speakers in, not just from the U.S., but from Canada and several European countries. Mm-hmm. And they had us speaking about various aspects of evolution. This conference had 1,100 people registered.
Oh, wow.
And most of them being students, not just from Ankara, but from across Turkey, coming to Ankara to listen to evolution. These were not necessarily biology students. These were people who just wanted to know about evolution. Some of them were teachers. Some of them were not students. Some of them were from other walks of life. Mm-hmm. But I want to mention this because the passion that these students and other people had for learning about evolution, I can't tell you how emotionally affected I was by just their thirst for knowledge, their passion to learn about what they understood to be a really important principle of science, a principle of biology, and one which, moreover, was forbidden. And understanding that repression of scientific knowledge is just antithetical to modern life. Mm-hmm. It really is, because of the importance of every aspect of science. Free inquiry and free discussion of scientific ideas is absolutely essential for every aspect of our life. And that's what these students recognized. So to have an audience of 1,100 people just sitting there on the edge of their seat listening to one talk after another was really inspiring.
Absolutely inspiring and reassuring, I think, that even in this environment that really doesn't support it, that interest still persists, that passion is still there.
Absolutely. That was so inspiring.
Well, these two trips sound like they couldn't be more different, but both wonderful in their own way.
And I've been plenty of other places, and they're all wonderful, too.
Yeah. We'll make our own show, Douglas. We'll talk about all the places you've been.
Yeah.
Well, I think throughout our conversation today, in addition to these great places, we've highlighted some of the great people that you've been able to work with. And I love talking about scientists as humans and all the wonderful things that we do in science that maybe people aren't aware of, because I think there are so many stereotypes out there about what scientists are like and how science is done. But I think much of what actually happens is contrary to these stereotypes. And a lot of these quirky lab traditions or funny memories or even just fond memories that you share with your colleagues really show this human side of science and show the world that it's not this isolated scientist working by themselves up in a laboratory. So Douglas, do you have one of these stories that you can share with us today that really shows this human side of science?
Probably the most rewarding aspect of my career has been working with students, and in particular with Ph.D. students. Mm-hmm. I've never told a Ph.D. student what to do. They have their ideas, and I help them work them out, and sometimes we'll talk out an idea together. And the result of this is, over the course of time, in the best of situations, you become friends and colleagues. The student is no longer a student, but a colleague. And nothing fosters that more than going out and doing extended field work together. Some of the most rewarding aspects of my career have been, I told you about these beetles, okay? So about 15 species of beetles that I was working on. Mm-hmm. And in order to get the DNA for the phylogenetic tree that I was talking about, I basically wanted to collect every species in this group of beetles. And that meant a whole lot of traveling around, especially in Western North America, and I don't want to travel around for a month or two on my own. Obviously, I want to have company, and no better company than a PhD student, especially one who's sort of starting and is not thoroughly embedded in their own research yet. So I did that for actually 3 summers. And of course, there are all kinds of incidents that happen. One of them, we're driving through, this is my student Gabrielle, and we're driving through Utah, and I saw this lake bed, and I thought, well, maybe one of our plants is growing down there. We should check out to see if we have that plant that has a certain beetle that I'm after. So we drove down this dirt track with some grass and weeds and stuff in the middle of the track, and we drive down there, and no, the plant's not growing. That was a waste of time. We drove back to the highway, continued. This is in western Utah, in this really remote area where we're heading westward toward Nevada, and we stop and driving along, there's a fence, and on the fence pole, there is a raven sitting. And on the next fence pole, there was a golden eagle.
Oh, wow.
And I've never, ever seen a golden eagle down next to the ground. I've seen quite a few of them, but they've usually been flying or perched way up on a mountainside. What are these birds doing here? And we saw what they were doing there. There was a dead animal on the road. They were obviously both eating. And the animal was a badger. And I have never seen a badger before, alive or dead. It's kind of weird looking, kind of skunky type member of the weasel family. Well, let's pull over to the road. I want to look at this badger. It might be the only one I ever get to see. So we pulled over, and I then noticed that there were a bunch of beetles attracted to the carcass. So I told Gabrielle, let's turn off the car. We'll be here for a while. I want to collect some of these beetles for my teaching collection. So we did that. And that was all very rewarding, turning over a dead badger and collecting beetles. So we get back in the car, and the truck won't start. And neither of us knows anything about auto mechanics. It's late afternoon. There's no traffic on this road, no one to stop and help us. And we ended up then just putting up our tent and camping for the night, having no idea what was going to happen in the morning. We had a very limited supply of water. I was also very worried that the truck could get too hot, and we had live insects that we were carrying, and we need to keep them cool. So I've been buying ice to put in the cooler with these containers full of live insects. So finally a guy comes along in a pickup truck, and this being the rural West, he realizes these people might need help. He says, let me get under and see if I can figure out what's going on. He said, okay. I says, do you have a quarter? I said, yeah. Give me the quarter, okay? Get in the driver's seat. And when I tell you to start it up, try starting it up.
Sure, yeah.
He's like, okay. And the car starts right up.
Really?
Yeah.
What did he do?
Well, there was some electrical connection or something between the starter and something else or whatever. I know about beetles, not cars. Right. Whatever it was, it got us on our way. But I've never been more thankful for the knowledge of people who really know how the world works.
And now you never travel without a quarter, right?
These non-academic things, boy, that's the kind of knowledge you need.
Right, right. And I'm sure this is a trip your PhD student at the time will never forget as well.
Yeah, well, there's another PhD student who will never forget, probably next summer, driving around with me. And I have a habit of getting up in the morning and do a couple of hours of birding while it was still too early and vegetation's too wet to collect beetles, and then really get into collecting beetles and driving to the next site and seeing if we could find the plant which has that beetle that we need. And I have a tendency to forget to eat.
Oh, no.
So Dan was with me. Dan's a great, big, athletic-looking, muscular guy or whatever, and driving along. And it's 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And I said, Dan, do we have any peanut butter and bread still? And he said, I thought you'd never ask. It has been 18 hours since we've had anything, and I thought you would never. I wanted to see how long you could go before you thought of eating.
Wow.
It had been basically since dinner the previous night. It was like almost 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Anyway, that's what happens when you get a little obsessed, I guess.
Right. You're into the work. I like it. Well, Doug, we mentioned that in addition to all this wonderful research that you've done, you have also written a book. And I love talking about books on our program. And I know you've not only written the textbook, but also a popular book for science. So do you have any book recommendations or things that you're reading right now or would like to add to our listeners' own reading lists?
Well, too many to name. One that I would like to recommend very highly. This is a book I could have written, I should have written, I didn't write, and I would not have written as well as it is written. And that is a book called Why Evolution is True. And it's by my friend who just recently retired from the University of Chicago, Jerry Coyne, Coyne, Why Evolution is True. And it is a short book. You can get through it in a couple of hours. And it is a brilliant and beautifully written description of all the various lines of evidence that overwhelmingly support the truth of evolution has happened and that all living things that we know of are descended from one form of life. It's a brilliantly written book, and I recommend it really highly.
Excellent.
Still within science, but very far from what I know anything about. I've just recently read a book by Robert Sapolsky called Behave. I think it's called Human Nature at its Best and Worst, or something like that. And Sapolsky is a behavioral biologist at Stanford. I don't know him. I've never read any of his work before. But this is, again, a wonderfully written book that talks about human behavior starting at the level of individual nerve cells. And then he makes you understand more or less how the brain works. And then that builds up into the things that influence our behavior. And he says, well, the things that influence our behavior have happened at a whole bunch of different times in history. First of all, there's evolution, which has produced the brain and its properties. And he talks about that. Then he says, secondly, there is culture. So we learn, and we learn largely what we are taught and what we absorb from our experiences in our culture. So we have both the evolved genetic component to behavior and the cultural learned behavior. And then he starts talking about the role of hormones when we're faced with a situation in which we both think and at the same time have emotional reactions and hormone-driven reactions, and comes down to then the immediate things that happen in the brain and the neurotransmitters and the connections that are being made in the brain that result in our behavior. And then he carries this forward into the social realm and talks about both aspects of why we can be cooperative and altruistic and loving, or on the other hand, why we can be hateful and aggressive and sometimes murderous. And I thought it was a brilliant book that covers behavior just across this incredible spectrum. That's been my most recent enjoyable read. I also read things outside the realm of science, and about a year ago, I finished what was at least a 6-year project to read in translation Proust's Remembrance of Things Past. The alternative and more accurate title is In Search of Lost Time. It's very long, and I have to say parts of it can be a little tedious, but in its best passages, there is nothing like it. His ability to describe emotions and to describe settings and to paint pictures of people and how they're behaving and especially how they are feeling is absolutely unparalleled. Mm-hmm. I reread passages again and again because of their beauty. I hope that doesn't sound too pretentious.
No, I love it.
That's been a major part of my reading life.
Yeah, that's a 6-year commitment right there.
Well, it wasn't full time.
Sure.
Mostly on trips. That's when I had the time to really sit down and read.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, Douglas, we will add these recommendations to our list online for our listeners out there. And one thing that I'd like to ask you to give our listeners today is a piece of advice. And this can be one that you received along your career path that was really helpful for you, or just one that you think would be really helpful for them.
I thought of one that's career relevant and one that's life relevant. Best advice ever, which of course I didn't take until long after it was given to me by any number of people. Best advice ever was stop smoking.
That's good advice.
So I did smoke for a number of years, and I just want to say that that was the best, the most important advice, and I finally took it, and I probably would not be alive talking to you if I hadn't. But in terms of career and life and profession or whatever, again, this is advice that I got from older graduate students when I was a grad student, and I think from my advisor. And again, I didn't quite follow it at first, and then I realized that this is absolutely the best advice you can get. And that is to engage yourself with something that you want to do. Follow your own curiosity. Follow what inspires you and follow what you love, what you just find most intriguing. I didn't do that for my Ph.D. thesis research. I instead did a project that I thought was important in terms of its theoretical implications for the field. And the result was that I spent hours and hours and hours sitting in the lab counting Drosophila fruit flies. And I think the project was intellectually very worthwhile, but the actual execution of it was basically kind of boring. I mean, here I was a naturalist. I was inspired and still am inspired by animals and plants and the beauty of the natural world. And here I was doing something that was pretty distant from that. And frankly, I didn't enjoy it. And I really only got to enjoy research and to really devote myself to it when I got into these projects. I'm working with a whole variety of insects and that would take me out into different habitats and learning different things, learning different groups of insects and their peculiarities. And that is something which, just if you like, more an aesthetic or emotional side to complement the intellectual pleasure that it gave me. So my advice really is follow what excites you. As I think I've said before, I'm as thrilled now by the beauty and diversity of the natural world as I was when I was in high school. And I still love going out there and seeing all these birds and learning local plants. And especially when I'm out birding, I'm also looking at birds or insects or whatever through the lenses of what I know as an evolutionary biologist. And I'm looking at something and I start thinking about, how do I interpret what I'm looking at? How do I interpret that bird's behavior or this insect's shape or its morphology or its coloration or the habitat it's living in? How do I think about that from my perspective as an evolutionary biologist? So for me, there's an aesthetic aspect and an intellectual aspect that are seamless. And I think that that aesthetic aspect has enriched me and helped to motivate me as a scientist. And my scientific knowledge, I think, really informs and helps me appreciate what I'm looking at and helps me appreciate how marvelous it is. So whether your passion is writing computer software or doing mathematical models of evolution or of climate change, or whether it's studying neuroscience or art or music or neurobiology or whatever it might be that excites you, you should follow that. Follow your heart. And there will be a way in which your particular passion can be developed into a successful and useful career.
I love it. Well, Douglas, thanks so much for sharing your insights. And we've talked about some of these projects that you've been so passionate about over the years during the course of our discussion. But I'm curious, if we gave you all of the resources you could dream of, anything you could possibly need, is there one big outstanding question, maybe outside of our cankerworm that we talked about earlier, that you are just dying to know the answer to?
There are a number, but I think probably within the field of evolution, I would say one that I still find really intriguing is there have been cases in which organisms have managed to adapt to what seems like a very different way of life, a very different kind of environment in which it's a little hard to imagine what the transitional stages might have been. How did you get from here to there? And a classic example would be aquatic vertebrate ancestors becoming land-living organisms. How did that happen? How do you make that transition? In that case, we do have some understanding. We do have some really important fossils that show us some of the steps by which that happened. But in other cases, well, like with my insects, monarch butterflies, their larvae feed on milkweeds, which are really toxic. Mm-hmm. You put your average insect on a milkweed plant and force it to eat it, and it'll just drop over dead. What were the stages? How did a non-milkweed feeding insect make the transition to feeding on this highly poisonous plant? That's just one example. How did woodpeckers evolve? Here you have this organism which engages in this really energy-consuming activity that takes an enormous amount of work to dig into live wood and extract a grub. That seems like a really hard transition to do. So there are a lot of these kinds of transitions in the history of life in which it might well be that there were just all sorts of little steps along the way that we don't know about. But sometimes it's like both the behavior and the anatomy has to change together. One doesn't make sense without the other. The first insects that started laying eggs on milkweed, their behavior had to have changed. You have to have the evolutionary programmed, if you're a monarch butterfly, to find a milkweed plant to lay your eggs on. But the first insect that did that laid eggs on a plant that their babies weren't adapted to. They would have dropped dead because the plant's poisonous. So how do these things work together? It's in the realm of complex adaptations where we have a lot of information, but there are still cases where I'd like to know how it happened. And this is not a matter of you'll never know that, and therefore it's unknowable, and therefore science can't answer this question. In other words, this sort of anti-scientific nihilism that you hear from creationists. But rather, here are questions in which we have some understanding, but not enough.
Well, Douglas, you have given us a lot to ponder today, so thank you for that. Is there any last message that you want to leave our listeners with at the end of our interview today?
Evolution is true. That's one. Mm-hmm. Seriously, I think my most important message is this. And it goes back to what I said earlier. Every aspect of our life depends on technology, on what has been developed that is founded on biology, physics, chemistry, geosciences, other sciences, which then engineers make use of that knowledge. And the result is they produce things that we absolutely depend on. What that means is that that science, by and large, is pretty trustworthy. It works. If it didn't work, we wouldn't be surviving right now. We wouldn't have the transportation. We wouldn't be talking to one another over Skype right now.
Right.
Everything we do depends on the fact that the science works. So science really is the best way to knowledge, the best and the most trustworthy vehicle we have for knowing how the world works. You should not pick and choose what you want to believe from what scientists say. That is not to say that we know all the answers. It's not to say that every scientific pronouncement is absolutely true, because almost inevitably we find that we have an incomplete understanding. Every science continues to advance because there are still things about almost everything that I've ever studied, that every scientist has studied. There are aspects in which we don't know enough. We're still questing. But what we do know includes a lot of very firm foundations. We really do know that inheritance is based on DNA, for example. So you can't just go around picking and choosing what scientists say that you like and what scientists say that you don't like and deciding you're going to accept the one and not the other. If you do that, you are making a really serious mistake. Right now in the United States, we're continually hearing about false facts, and there's this whole growing movement toward this notion that facts don't matter, that we don't really know anything, you can't trust anyone, what do scientists know, and this anti-scientific and, frankly, anti-truth movement that's going on, some of it at the highest levels of government. I think this is so dangerous, I can't begin to say. And this is true, of course, not just with respect to authoritative information coming from science, but from other realms as well. So there has to be some understanding that some sources of information are trustworthy, others are not, and to learn how to discriminate between them. And among them, by and large, science is trustworthy, and it is very important to accept and to nurture and to foster the process of science.
Absolutely. Well said, Douglas, and such an important message to share with our listeners, the world, and our country today. So thank you for that. And thank you so much for all of your insights and all of the stories you've shared with us on the program today. It's been such a pleasure to chat with you.
It's been a great pleasure, and I really appreciate your questions. And really, this has been very enjoyable, and thank you very much.
Absolutely. And if our listeners want to learn more about you and what you do, how can they get in touch?
Probably the best would be my email address. That's dfutuyma, DFUTUYMA @gmail.com.
Perfect. Well, listeners, definitely get in touch if you have any questions for Douglas. And Douglas, it's been wonderful to have you on the show. And listeners, wonderful to have you here as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science.